Hello all, and welcome to this month's episode of The Global and the Granite State, a podcast of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. What a time we all live in, where the world is changing at such a rapid pace, and military conflict seems to be the tool of choice these days. My name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, as well as your host for this program. Thank you for tuning in to this important conversation on the conflict between the United States and Iran. This is a rapidly developing story, so much may have changed since we recorded and posted this episode, so please bear with us now. As always, a huge thank you to everyone who makes this work possible, from our members to our donors, sponsors, and other supporters. We could not bring you this timely content without your engagement and financial support. A special thank you to McLean Middleton, who has continued to support this critical work throughout the years. McLean Middleton is one of New England's premier full-service law firms with over 115 attorneys throughout offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. McLean Middleton's attorneys have been providing trusted legal services to businesses throughout the region for over 100 years. Learn more at mclean.com. Without further ado or delay, let's get on with the conversation. Start this off by making a little disclaimer. I originally set up this interview with a view to the future, when the US, Israel, and Iran war was still being talked about as a potential war. I recorded this with Alex Vatanka of the Middle East Institute on Friday, February 27th, one day before the start of the war. I pulled this all together and posted it on March 4th with the information available at the time. All this to say, we are doing our best to provide insightful, timely information as the realities shift minute by minute. So, where do we stand as of today? On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel began an aerial assault on Iran after weeks of growing tensions and a massive military buildup by the United States in the region, after attempts at a negotiated settlement. We are now in day 4 of this air campaign, and hundreds of people have been killed around the region by all forms of drones, missiles, and bombs. Civilian and military infrastructure has been targeted and destroyed across the Middle East, and every day seems to bring a new combatant into the fight. Regardless of where you fall on your opinions of this war, the fact that this will have long-lasting repercussions for the region and the world remains constant across the political spectrum. However, before we dive too deeply into the current state of affairs, let's step back and look at how we got here.
Fundamentally, I think after 1979, when the Islamists took over in the country of Iran, by plan, by design, or sort of fell into it, they, within a few years, had basically turned the entire revolution into a fight against the United States, what they call imperialism, Western domination. It wasn't what people in Iran in 1979 really came in the streets for. What they were demanding were much more about political representation at home at the time. They were leaving absolute monarchy of the Shah. They wanted something more representative, but they got a lot more than they bargained for. And this new Islamist entity that took over and has been in power for 47 years has essentially on autopilot. Anything that has to do with the United States has been one for them to fight back on. So it starts really early on, November 1979, taking over the U.S. Embassy. They felt the Americans were concocting a plot to come in and stop the revolution from giving power to the Islamists. So they took the American diplomats hostage. And from then onwards, you name it, there's a long list of things that they have blamed the United States for.
For a popular culture reference here, at least for the younger generations who did not live through the Iran hostage crisis, you may remember the Ben Affleck film Argo, which uses the storming of the American embassy as its story. Okay, back to our history lesson, however. At the time of the revolution in 1979, Iran was ruled by a constitutional monarchy which established its first parliament and constitution in 1909. From 1941 to 1979, the system was run by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who took over from his father in the wake of the Second World War. A key moment in the story comes in 1953, when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was ousted via a coup d'etat, which was supported by the United States and the United Kingdom in response to his attempts to nationalize the oil industry, a move that was supported by the National Parliament. The Shah then consolidated more power under his authority and eventually led to the protests which overthrew the government. So, almost overnight, Iran went from friend to foe, and that relationship stayed hostile for 47 years.
Give you one example. They blame the United States for instigating the Iran-Iraq war, where objective historians will say the Iranians were as guilty, probably far more, in what happened, why that war started, because the system essentially was Islamist ideological. It wanted to not just confront the United States, it wanted to confront everyone. I remember as a child in Iran in the early 80s, the slogan was no to the West, meaning the United States, and no to the East at the time, meaning the Soviet Union. And it was an ideological project. It turned anti-Americanism into an important pillar of this revolution. And they never kind of looked back seriously to sort of reconsider in a meaningful way why they did that, what it was worth the fight.
Now, of course, just because a government, particularly an authoritarian one, pursues a policy does not mean it reflects the will of the people.
A lot of Iranians over the years have questioned that, wanted to change course and say Iran and the United States could look for ways where their mutual interests can be served in a relationship that's not hostile. But I think personally, Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader since 1989, has invested so much in sort of standing up to the United States. And today, it seems, as the United States has brought the armada to Iran's doorsteps, Khamenei's openly speaking about martyrdom and fighting the tyrant, meaning Donald Trump. So yeah, it's so much of this is about ideology. So much of this is about pride of a certain group that run Iran today, that they find themselves wanted to stand up to the United States at any cost, even if they're risking so much of Iranian national interest, including potentially a disastrous war. When I look at it from a point of view of Iran, the country, and its national interest, certainly the last few decades of Iranian behavior towards the United States could have been very different, could have been far less hostile. Obviously, there's the other side of the equation. They will tell you, if you ask Khamenei, will say, well, we're the only ones who were hostile. The other party was also hostile. Element of truth in that too as well. But I think the sort of fight starts really in 1979, and why a set of actors inside that regime chose anti-Americanism as a vehicle to build legitimacy around as they took over that country. And for some small groups in Iranian society, that worked. For a majority of Iranians, they never saw any sense in it and have always opposed it. And they blame the ideology of Ali Khamenei and his group for the critical, sad moment Iran finds itself in today.
Of course, since we recorded this, the US government has brought more than just an armada. They have utilized that force and killed Khamenei, along with at least 48 other senior leaders, according to the Trump administration's count. Of course, there is the bombing of the U.S. Marine Corps barracks in Lebanon, multiple missile attacks, and support for destabilizing proxies throughout the region that has inflamed tensions between the two countries. This relationship, however, is not just one way.
The start in 1979, the hostage crisis, that set us in the wrong trajectory, if you will, from get-go. And no serious effort was made on either side, essentially, to rectify that situation. So again, I tend to blame the Iranian regime far more than I tend to blame the United States, although the U.S. isn't innocent. There have been moments the U.S. could have acted differently. Fundamentally, the decision where you kind of do a bit of soul searching and say, why am I in this fight for? On the part of the Iranians didn't happen. On the part of the United States, they had to deal with, from an American point of view, an openly hostile regime from get-go. This takes us back to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was perfectly happy to coexist or accept the new post-Shah Islamist rule. He had other issues to worry about, namely fighting the Cold War against the Soviets. And yet the regime in Tehran, for whatever reason, decided that they were not interested. So fast forward to the 2000s, to present day, U.S. list of grievances includes not only the open political hostility, the language of hostility from Tehran, but also questioning U.S. right to be the dominant hegemon, if you will, in the Middle East. The Iranians openly have, for years, talked about the need to push the Americans out of the Middle East. And those allies of the United States, including the Gulf countries, have been called all sorts of names as servants of the Americans, as stooges of the Americans, as slaves of the Americans. So very much an anti-status quo force by and large in its history, not to mention their position on Israel, which those of us who live in Washington know how important Israel is for many American policymakers, and Iran's insistence that Israel has to be confronted and simply doesn't have a right to exist because they call it a Zionist entity. They don't even call it by its name, Israel. You put all that together, and I didn't even speak of Iranian support for terrorism over the last 47 years, which is a reality. It's not as some people claim today, but it was certainly a big factor in the 1980s, 1990s. We remember, for example, the attack on the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, I think it was 96. The nature of the regime and the fact that in the last 22, 23 years, it has sort of set out to have access to nuclear technology, expanded its missile program. All these things became issues of concern, not to mention human rights violations of the Iranian people, which I think in the pecking order of things is probably not the most urgent for US national interest, since the US deals with all sorts of nasty regimes around the world. But all of it together in a package, it just sort of made life easier for successive American administrations to sort of, instead of seeking for ways to come to some kind of a resolution with the Iranians, look for the day it would no longer be in power and the US could go back and have the sort of friendly relationship it had, for example, with the Shah.
There have, however, been some diplomatic breakthroughs over the years, despite this tense relationship. In the mid-1980s, the Reagan administration arranged a backdoor deal that sold weapons to Iran, despite an arms embargo passed by the U.S. Congress. The proceeds of those sales then were sent to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, which led to the Iran-Contra scandal. Despite the scandal, this was an attempt to soften relations between the two countries. George H.W. Bush got Iran to support a UN resolution against Iraq in 1990 for invading Kuwait, with the U.S. opting to lift objections to a World Bank loan to Iran. In the wake of September 11th attack, Iran was initially sympathetic to the United States, having denied sanctuary to al-Qaeda members in Iran and providing intelligence on at least 300 terrorists. They even assisted in overthrowing the Taliban and supported the government of Hamid Karzai. Unfortunately, the Bush administration was not open to a warming of relations, including Iran in the Axis of Evil speech in 2002. You then had the JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal, in 2015, which attempted to reset relations. However, since that point, the tensions have continued to grow on both sides, and now we find ourselves in the middle of a war that seeks a broad range of objectives.
President Trump right now is probably making the gamble of his life. He looks at the Iranian regime, as hated as it is by people, and he doesn't believe in coalition building. He doesn't necessarily want international law and norms dictate what he can do. He looks at what the US has in terms of military capabilities. He looks at a weak Iranian regime with the people that want it gone, and he thinks, you know what, I can turn myself into some leader that is going to be hailed by at least the Iranians as the savior of the nation, if you will. As I said, it's a huge gamble. The Iranian regime has agency. They have ways of retaliating. They have promised they will retaliate in case of war.
And retaliate they have. Firing over 1,500 missiles and drones in the first 3 days, Iran has targeted at least 11 countries. At this point, at least 6 American service members have been killed, with many more injured in these counterattacks. At least 12 people have been killed in Iranian strikes across the region. Iranian officials claim around 800 people have been killed in the U.S. and Israeli attacks, including 165 people at a school adjacent to, but separate from, a military base. The vast majority of those killed in the strike were girls between the ages of 7 and 12. This has certainly been a sad time frame for the sanctity of life. So why are we at this point where thousands of lives are put at risk, the future implications are so unclear, and 8 previous presidential administrations have avoided this move?
That's really essentially a political call that whoever's making that decision has to make. President Obama at the time had exactly the same concerns President Trump has today in terms of, for example, what Iran is doing in the region, the nature and intentions behind its ballistic missile program, so on. But back then they decided those things can be put aside. What was realistic at a relatively low cost was a diplomatic solution, which resulted in the JCPOA, the nuclear deal of 2015. President Trump takes a different political stance. He doesn't think that's good enough. He famously called it a horrible deal. He wants basically to defang, if you will, the Islamist elite in Iran. So it's not just a nuclear issue. It's everything that they represent, maybe, and that's something we might find out soon, all the way to actually bringing an end to the regime. So the nature of a regime has not really fundamentally changed that much since 1979. Islamist, militant, tone deaf, repressive at home, adventurous in foreign policy. What has changed has been more in Washington. Some American presidents have had other issues to worry about, less appetite to engage in this conflict with Iran. President Trump might be very different. Again, he might back away if the Iranians offer him something, which they're trying hard to do. They know that they have to give him something that's better than 2015. They're trying to do that. The question for Iran and for the United States is, does the minimum that the United States expect is the maximum what the Iranians can offer? You have to have that convergence. And so far they have failed. So far, the United States has been not willing to just limit itself to the nuclear issue, wants to talk about totality of various things the regime does. And the regime's response is, if we do all the things you're asking us for, we won't be that regime anymore. We'll be a very different regime, and we would be essentially tamed, unable to even defend ourselves. And that is a proposition they're rejecting, and they rather risk war with the United States in the faint hope that Trump will back away once Iran proves to him that it can retaliate harder than the American side anticipates.
Diplomacy, for many reasons, failed in this circumstance, and war has been unleashed. It remains very unclear how this proceeds and when it comes to an end. President Trump has indicated that this air campaign will probably go on for weeks, and has refused to rule out sending American troops into Iran to achieve his goals. Of course, this can all come to an abrupt stop, too. Just a quick note here to remind you that Alex's response came before the war started, but I believe the sentiment still stands.
Really depends on what you want. If you're just solely focused on the nuclear issue, a deal is ready right now. I mean, they can probably be convinced to give up enrichment for a long time, certainly for the next 3 years while President Trump is in the White House. But his advisors, some of them are telling him that's not good enough, that you should fix this issue once and for all, don't turn it into a headache for somebody else who comes after you. So again, a political issue. For the reality is Iran's capacity to have the weapon, it's not going to happen anytime soon. They have the capacity, but it's not going to be something that is going to be done next week. Therefore, you don't need to go to war next week to end that ambition. That is happening now because, as I said earlier, there's a window of opportunity. The regime is on its back foot, if you will, and some in the Trump administration convinced the president this is not a bad time to flex some muscle. The other side has agency. They're pushing back, and we have to wait and see if the president decides, I take a slightly better deal, nuclear deal that Obama got in 2015. I take that, I declare victory, and I move on because I don't want to risk a large American war in the Middle East because I've always been against it. Or he might decide, I will risk it because I fundamentally think the regime will collapse under its own weight and it's a risk worth taking.
So, will a deal be struck? Will Iranians take to the streets and overthrow what is left of their government? Will the United States and Israel go for the final assault and take over the country? So much is left to be written here, and no one really knows, at this point, how it all ends. However, Alex did share a very prescient insight about how the initial days of this war may play out.
They're saying they're going to retaliate harder to make sure Iran doesn't end up being a sitting duck, that whenever the United States feels like bombing them, the United States has a free hand to do so. So that what they are trying to plan and figure out and see if they have the capacity to do is inflict pain on the United States very quickly, both in terms of getting to American troops, but also American allies, which are much easier target for them in the Gulf, in Israel, elsewhere. Again, with the hope that that might just suddenly get Trump's attention and Trump decides to not dig deeper, if you will, this is an Iranian perspective, and walk away. If the regime feels that ultimate goal is regime change, that the first round of airstrikes will be followed by much more airstrikes, which could happen given the size of the US forces deployed, then they're fighting for their survival. At that point, I'm sure they will try and hurt as many, not just the Americans, but many others, in that last desperate attempt to get enough pressure on Trump, essentially back away. Again, on their part, this is also a gamble. But I don't think either side really is taking the issue of unpredictability once the bullet starts firing. There's an element once you escalate and it gets out of hand. And I think both sides are very much aware of the dangers that lie there.
We are certainly seeing this now, again, with 11 countries targeted by Iran across the Middle East. Their targeting of civilian infrastructure has won them no allies in this fight, as everyone seems to be condemning Iranian attacks in the strongest of terms. However, prior to the initiation of this war, people around the world, including right here in the United States, were skeptical of the soundness of this war.
Number one is it's not just around the world that there is so much doubt about the wisdom behind going to war. I mean, the United States, about 20% are for this war, apparently. That's pretty low for taking the country to war with a medium-sized country, 3 times the size of France with 92 million people. So it's not just around the world where people have that doubt in terms of the wisdom. I think also that doesn't mean they like the regime. People around the world surely were not blind. They saw what the regime did to his own people just a few months ago. But what is really at the heart of this is whether the United States has a game plan, whether the United States is actually just going to drop bombs and get bored and leave and maybe bring about state collapse in a pretty significant country, which will have ramifications for across the region, or whether the United States has a clear-cut plan for using military force to bring about a political outcome it wants, namely in this case, changing the regime in Tehran. There is, to my mind, a lot of questions on that because, again, when you're sitting somewhere in the world and look at what U.S. policy has been in the Middle East, you look at Afghanistan, you look at Iraq and so on, you go, well, they haven't really achieved any clear-cut successes. Why would we think they will do that this time around? They might be wrong, these people around the world, but I think it's a legitimate concern to have.
The question of what the outcome will be cannot be answered quickly. Even if the US and Israel were to stop their operations today and agree to some deal with whoever is in charge of Iran at this time, there's no certainty that a better outcome will be achieved. There is also no certainty that a worse outcome will arise either. Only time will tell, based on the millions of decisions yet to be made.
If you are the Iranian people, they would love to see the end of the Islamic Republic. And I think a good number of them, if not a majority of them, might not be opposed to the idea of a foreign intervention, getting rid of the Ayatollah and his regime. I think a lot of Iranians are not sure about if it's going to go well. What if it doesn't? What are the ramifications? Because they've seen people rising up in various countries in the Middle East in the recent 2 decades, and it hasn't gone well and ended up in civil wars, Syria, Libya, and so forth. There is that fear. If you're sitting in Israel, this is the best thing that could happen to you. A large country not far away from you who has basically been after your destruction from the moment it was conceived. So you want to see the end of it, but that's a very Israeli point of view, and they don't have the capacity to end this regime on their own. They have to essentially go hand in hand or ask the Americans to do it for them. We know the politics of the United States, lots of question marks about the wisdom for this American president to anything like this, a lot of opposition. So again, really comes down to who you ask and what motivates them, because the world looks different depending on where in it you stand. What I see is not what somebody else sees somewhere else. So it's subjective in that sense. I think fundamentally this is a regime that has lost its way, lost its people. Islamic Republic is only in power because of the repression, because of its willingness to kill its own people and maybe others to stay in power. But the big question is, and this is where you have to make that call, is the best way military strikes? Is the best way helping the Iranian people within the country over a patient few years ahead to create the conditions where they can take over that country? Major project. It requires a lot of commitment, investments on the part of those who want to support such an effort. So there are different ways of looking at it. I certainly don't think we're doing this right now because there's an Iranian nuclear weapon just about to be exploded. I don't think that's the scenario. The scenario is there's an 86-year-old man who lost his way a long time ago, who refuses to budge. He doesn't listen to his own people. He doesn't want to cut compromises that at least Trump is asking for. And that might just create the conditions for those who are making the argument that take the risk and take this war to Iran and hope for the best. But it is a hope for the best because there's no certainty in terms of what would really happen once this conflict, if it starts. And when it starts, it could wrap up fast. It might not.
Again, there is so much left to be written in this major geopolitical moment. No one knows how this will all turn out and whether this will be a net good or a net bad for the world, the Middle East, Iranians, and others. Democracy is not an easy thing to maintain, let alone build from the ground up in a country that has no experience in that form of government and does not have a strong opposition party. As we saw across the Middle East throughout the Arab Spring, popular uprisings like the one being called for by President Trump do not often lead to a stable democracy. Foreign interventions have been even less likely to foster democracy, especially without a sustained and expensive plan to rebuild countries in the wake of a regime change. The Marshall Plan remains the best example of how to foster democracy in countries during post-conflict reconstruction. While we have touched on Israel's role in all of this, I do want to bring a major point shared by Secretary of State Marco Rubio as to why the United States went to war with Iran at this moment in time. On Monday, March 2nd, while speaking to reporters, Secretary Rubio stated, and I quote, "We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces, and we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties." In addition, Rubio later added, "Obviously, we were aware of Israeli intentions and understood what that would mean for us, and we had to be prepared to act as a result of it. But this had to happen no matter what." President Trump has clarified, indicating that he may have forced Israel's hand, muddying the waters further on exactly what prompted this action, but clarifying that the U.S. wanted to take this action. I want to end this conversation with a bit of insight into the why, rather than the why now. The U.S. has put out various reasons for why we are at war and what the objectives are. These range from human rights abuses of the Iranian regime to their support for regional proxies and the ever-present nuclear question. All of these questions are long-standing and have varying degrees of nuance, which we don't have time to go into all today. However, there may be one key issue that is different from previous decades that has empowered the president to think now is the time.
Let me just put out the official Iranian line on this, which is that they are not interested in nuclear weapon, that they want this for civilian uses. The obvious counter to that is there are many other better ways where you can have access to nuclear technology without it costing you so much, namely sanctions and potentially war. So the regime, again, has to be seen in terms of what it says it's about in the context of what it does. And what it does is what raises questions about its intention. So when you are a regime that over the last few weeks we've seen tens of thousands of Iranians potentially killed by the regime, it's not hard to argue this is not the sort of regime you want sensitive technology trusted to. So that, again, it takes us to the nature of regime. And in terms of why President Trump is doing this now, why didn't George Bush, who had at one point 100,000 troops next door in Iraq, why didn't take action then? Because the nuclear program of Iran was a concern then too. Well, the reason is, and I don't think, by the way, what the president is saying about Iran having a nuclear weapon next week is true, basically. I don't think it's a correct statement. There's no evidence to suggest that the same nuclear sites that President Trump bombed successfully, in his own estimation, last summer, are suddenly giving the Iranians the option to weaponize within a week. I don't think any serious analyst believes that. Nor are they about to fire ballistic missiles at the United States. If they ever get to that point, it will be a number of years at least into the future. What we have in terms of a driver is a political sort of a calculation on the part of President Trump and his team that favor this course of action, that the regime that, again, hated by its own people, it's very weak, it has no legitimacy to speak of, and this is a window of opportunity to, if you will, go for the kill, to bring it down once and for all, because that's the only way you can solve this issue of the Islamic Republic, and you don't have to worry about tactical deals here and there on nuclear issue of missiles or anything else. Go for regime change. The window of opportunity is now. This is exactly why I think we're seeing U.S. move into action. I don't think it's because we've detected that they're dashing for a bomb or they're about to launch a ballistic missile at the U.S. I don't think those are happening. I think it's an opportunity that happened as a result of basic realities politically inside of Iran, where the United States feels that it can, through perhaps military action, create the conditions for the Iranian people to take over the country, if you will, from Ayatollah Khamenei and his people. Again, it's a big gamble, but that seems to be what, at least part of the calculations of President Trump.
It certainly has proven to be a major gamble, and regardless of the outcome, this war already has fostered serious consequences. Only time and perspective will tell if this gamble pays off, or if this country of 95 million people will fracture and descend into a majorly destabilizing civil war, with consequences that will reverberate around the world. All I can say with any confidence is, buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Thank you for listening to this month's Global in the Granite State, a program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We appreciate your interest and invite your feedback. If you enjoyed the program, like and subscribe to make sure you are updated on all future episodes, and take a listen to our back catalog for other timely conversations. As always, Tim Horgan is the be-all and end-all for this program. Our theme music remains Admin by A.A. Alto. Join us next month.